Thank you, Paul. And so I'm really excited to talk about big books and celebrity intellectuals, how Erich Fromm created the 60s and why his public sociology didn't succeed. And this talk comes out of a book I recently published on Erich Fromm and global public sociology. And what I want to do is talk about the story of how the book came to be, talk a little bit about Fromm's intellectual influences on the 60s, and then shift a little bit and talk about not about ideas, but what Fromm actually did as an activist. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on his limitations, some thoughts for sociology some follow-up sociology. And I'm going to end on a polemic, a little bit two cents about my own views about politics. So how I came to write this book. So initially I was a Canadian who got a soccer scholarship at Cleveland State University, and a number of people here from Cleveland and say hello. And I didn't succeed in making professional soccer. That was the idea. But Cleveland State, they made me take some classes, and I was very much influenced by a book called Escape from Freedom. And this made me into someone who cared about ideas. And I was the book was in 1941, and it was a social psychological analysis of Nazism. And the part that I was most interested in was the socialist Fromm. It was a psychoanalytic theory, a sociological, but there was a socialist Fromm there that really pulled me in. And out of that, I got involved in the socialist movement in Cleveland. And eventually I moved to New York City to move America to the left. I succeeded in that as well as I did in playing professional soccer, unfortunately. I ended up in New York at the City University of New York. And at the time, I was in a graduate program. I didn't really see myself as an academic at that time, maybe a little arrogant, but I thought that an academic was somewhere a little bit above a serial killer on the moral universe. I sort of wanted to be an intellectual, not an academic. But eventually I figured out I needed a job, and on the way, I fell in love with sociology. And I picked Fromm as a sociological topic. And so it came out of, the next one, Vanessa. This came out of an observation and a sociological question. What I observed is that dozens, even hundreds of socialists and sociologists were inspired by Erich Fromm, became socialists, became interested in the sociological imagination from reading Fromm. But the closer you got to elite sociology and the closer you got to the leaders of the socialist movement, the more people were dismissive of Fromm. So this was a puzzle to me. And so I tried to answer that by thinking about how Fromm became a forgotten intellectual. And I wrote a whole bunch of stuff on that and got tenure here at McMaster. And after 15 years of writing about other things, I came back to this topic because of the influence of Michael Burroway, who's an American sociologist who wrote about what he called public sociology, an attempt, there's a little different types of sociology that he outlined, but the final one, the fourth one, was an attempt to be a public sociologist, to dialogue with the public. So the book, next one, the book is really an attempt to place Fromm as a public sociologist. And there's a number of famous sociologists that some of you will recognize: David Reesman, C. Wright Mills, W.E.B. Du Bois, who are often described as public sociologists or critical sociologists, in the case of Canada's own Dorothy Smith. And Fromm never really made the cut in terms of people who were seen as public sociologists. So next one. So the book really tries to do three major things. First, it tries to make an argument that Fromm belongs in this public sociology canon. He wrote 30 books that sold over 1 million copies each. No sociologist in the 20th century and no Marxist sociologist had as much staying power and influence. The book also tries to make the argument that Fromm's ideas are relevant for today. And finally, it's an attempt to think about what we can learn about public academics and intellectuals in politics with the case of Fromm. Next slide. So now I'm going to move to talking about how Fromm created the 60s and what he did as an activist. And I would say that he was by far the most prominent Marxist intellectual among mass publics in the mid-20th century. I would argue that he laid the intellectual foundation for a new left politics of authenticity. It's a phrase from Marshall Berman, who I took classes with at the City University of New York, and Marshall never really bought my argument for Fromm, but I do think his case for this politics of authenticity captures what the 60s was about, at least part of what the 60s was about, and Fromm very much contributed to that. And I would say that no intellectual figure of this period stands out as a global figure for freedom, not compromised by either support for the American empire or Soviet or Chinese Stalinism. Next slide. So now, obviously, Fromm didn't create the 60s on his own. And here I'm drawing from some important work by two sociologists of social movements who outline a critique of this great book's myth. Next slide. So, one can, it's often said that Betty Friedan created the feminist movement with the feminine mystique. Michael Harrington created the war on poverty with The Other America. Rachel Carson's created the environmental movement with The Silent Spring. This is not true, of course. And the big myth, the big next slide, the big book myth rightly suggests that movements create change, not books. And this reality is distorted by scholars, journalists, and activists themselves who focus on the books as a key element of social change. So I agree with that critique. Fromm didn't create the 60s, but I think we should not underestimate the interaction of books and movements. And so this is a case study where I want to try and complicate that analysis. Next slide. And so some of the books that Fromm wrote, the big books, Escape from Freedom in 1941, The Sane Society was an important part of the early New Left. The Art of Loving sold 26 million copies. And the later books from 61 to 68, he had a heart attack in 1968 and withdrew from politics. These were important books in critiquing American foreign policy and articulating Marxist humanism. So next slide. So to think about how Fromm created the 60s, I think you want to look at ideas and social context. So Fromm had an unusual synthetic combination of ideas. He was a radical Freudian, existentialist Marxist, and a sociological social psychologist. As well, he played multiple roles that created a certain independence. See, he was a therapist, a critical theorist, a writer, and an activist. And this case study is really about the importance of books after the invention of the paperback and before social media. So the game changes later. But I would argue then there are three steps in terms of how Fromm became one of the seeds of the 60s. He became a famous public intellectual sociologist from 1929 to 1950. Second, he offered a critique of Cold War America in what Irving Howe called this age of conformity. 1955 and 56 is key. And then from 1955 to 68, he became an activist. So I'm going to go through each of these step by step. So Fromm was part of the Frankfurt School. People think of Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, later Habermas, as key people in the Frankfurt School. But Fromm was actually a central figure in this group of thinkers. And they fled Nazi Germany, went to Columbia. They went to Columbia University because Fromm had done an empirical study that later became the authoritarian personality study in a major work of social psychology. The Escape from Freedom book was a best-selling classic that combined psychology, history, and politics, and it offered a social psychology of Nazi extremism. And part of the appeal of the book is he argued that while the book was written to help push America into the Second World War, Fromm was not a pacifist. He thought that Nazism needed to be defeated, but he never moved away, or he never backed off from emphasizing that fascism could happen here. And there is a revival in Fromm's work that's happening now, and that's unfortunate. set of events in the world. The second step is he created the template for what we call public sociologists. So Man for Himself was a psychology of ethics, where he developed a critique of what he called the marketing character. This is a personality type dominated by market values. And this book influenced David Riesman, who wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd. This is the best-selling sociology book of all time, the first sociologist to be on the cover of Time magazine. He later became a very important Harvard public sociologist. And this set of ideas that Riesman and Fromm developed together, it's one of the more bizarre conspiracy theories. If you look at Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, he suggests in the book that Fromm and Riesman were responsible for the 1960s by spreading Nietzschean ideas and individualistic ideas around America. Kind of bizarre conspiracy theory. It's certainly not true, but it is true that both of those books laid the foundation for some of the ideas that would later motivate people in social movements. So the second step is that Fromm became a social critic in the age of the conformity. So the Sane Society argued that modern affluent society creates pathologies of normalcy, drug and alcohol abuse, greed, loneliness, conformity. And he articulated an alternative vision of a utopian community-based socialism that had a major influence on the Port Huron statement Tom Hayden drew on C. Rhett Mills and on Fromm to lay the foundation for a new movement of students. A second part is a focus on critiquing lovelessness in a market society. The book, The Art of Loving, again, sold 26 million copies. And before Arlie Hochschild emphasized the importance of the commercialization of feelings, and before feminism emphasized the ways in which love can be rationalized as control, Fromm articulated a critique of patriarchal values and argued for a new vision for intimate relations. When I was an activist in Cleveland, I went down to Dayton one time and to do political work. Barbara Ehrenreich was speaking there, and I was organizing to try and recruit people to the movement. And there was a retired activist from Dayton who went to the talk, and I talked to her after. She found out I was a grad student, asked that dreaded question, what is your research on? And I said, I'm writing about Erich Fromm. And she said to me, Erich Fromm, I left my husband after reading The Art of Loving. The book argued, in very powerful ways that it shaped people's lives. Martin Luther King would quote Fromm. He read the book, and in his one of his speeches before he got his Nobel Prize in London, he invoked Erich Fromm to make the case that his concept of love was not sentimental, and it had kind of radical implications. And this was in the moment when he was a democratic socialist. The great African-American public intellectual Bell Hooks, who just passed away, unfortunately, in December, was influenced by Fromm, and in her trilogy about love, she draws extensively from Fromm. She improves on Fromm. There's a deeper feminist analysis, and Fromm didn't have a theory of anti-Black racism in the way that Bell Hooks did, but Fromm's ideas shaped Hooks' work in important ways. So now, in terms of like being actually a political activist in this period, Fromm in his youth was a Marxist follower of Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg. He wrote open letters and petitions in support of the Palestinians. Jack Jacobs' book on the Frankfurt School and Jewish lives emphasized of all the critical theorists, Fromm was the most pro-Palestinian. So he did work of that nature, kind of slacktivism in a certain way, but it's not insignificant, signing open letters and mobilizing behind the scenes. But most of the time he spent his time building critical theory, staying alive, getting his relatives out of Germany so they were not murdered by the Nazis, and healing people. He had a very active clinical practice. So he didn't really have that much time for active politics. But after 1955, he became biographically more available. His second wife had passed away. He had moved to Mexico by that time. He moved in 1950, and he had established the Psychoanalytic Institute in Mexico City, and that was well established. And then he threw himself into active politics. So next slide. So this is the third point. So I'm moving here into chapter 5, where I lay out what Fromm actually did in terms of his political work. And so one of the things that he did is he spent a major amount of his time and energy and gave lots of money. He was wealthy by this time from writing all these books. He threw himself into anti-war activism and building movements against the nuclear arms race. The anti-nuclear organization SANE was named after Fromm's book, The Same Society. He was a major human rights activist. He had a cousin who was an anti-Stalinist Marxist who survived Nazi camps and then was kidnapped from West Germany by the East German government and put in prison again. And Fromm got him out of prison, working with Bertrand Russell, who was quite influenced by Escape from Freedom, and they were friends. And Fromm gave an enormous amount of money to Amnesty International, and his cousin eventually got out and was one of the early prisoners of conscience for Amnesty International. He was very involved in the in socialism in America, the Socialist Party of America, and he also worked in the Democratic Party primaries trying to get Eugene McCarthy elected, unsuccessfully, and working against the Vietnam War around the same time. So next slide. So the chapter 5 was basically what I talk about is the books that Fromm wrote alongside of this activism. So May Man Prevail is a critique of American foreign policy. Fromm was, in a certain way, the Noam Chomsky of the 50s, or you could put it another way. Noam Chomsky was the Erich Fromm of the 70s and 80s and 90s. His book, Marxist Concept of Man, was instrumental in building in or promoting a Marxist theory of alienation in sociology. So there's a whole range of more professional and more empirical work that Paul Glavin will know well, that was influenced by Fromm's more theoretical writings on alienation. He organized a global anti-Stalinist Marxist humanist tradition, and there's a book he edited, and he offered a critique in the Revolution of Hope of technology, and offered a hopeful vision for social change in these days of rage, and leading up to the victory from his perspective, Richard Nixon. Next slide. So I want to just sort of give you one little example about why Fromm's public sociology ultimately failed. Made a case that he made some contributions, but it ultimately failed. And it has to do, the example I'll give is his involvement in the Socialist Party of America that was led by Norman Thomas at the time. And Norman Thomas is sort of like the Bernie Sanders of the time, or a Canadian, the Tommy Douglas of the time. But the party was really going into decline, and Fromm was involved in trying to revive it. And he wrote a popular pamphlet that was used by the party to recruit members. So he brought in many, many members into the Socialist Party with a very well-written pamphlet on humanistic Marxism. But unfortunately, he suffered from some of the arrogance of intellectuals, because he thought that the party should adopt that pamphlet for its program. And he didn't quite understand the difference between essays and research and political organizing. And I think his lack of involvement over decades in movements meant that his politics and some of his analysis suffered. So he had too little involvement with the labor movement, too little involvement with feminism, and too little involvement for anti-racist work at the grassroots level. So I think his work suffered from that. So he ended up the 60s, kind of a disillusioned radical. His reputation went into decline for reasons that I've written about and have rethought in the book. He went into sort of a period of time. He moved back to Europe, to Switzerland. He re-engaged. He had a long-term interest in Buddhism, but he focused on Buddhism and meditation. He wrote books that are a little bit more spiritual and philosophical, maintained a commitment to radical humanism, but didn't leave an institutional legacy in the left. And I think that was a failing on his part. So just to conclude then, what we're seeing now, I think, is a major Fromm revival. Unfortunately, Trumpism, and Fromm had a theory of the politics of narcissism and a theory of the power of emotions. So these theoretical contributions, a set of powerful ideas that do need a reframing, and we can talk about that at some point, but they're having an influence among many younger scholars. That's quite exciting. I do think that at the same time, as a word of caution, there were large parts of Fromm's work that was overly preachy, and I would say that sometimes that can be the case in some academic work today, or academic left work. Overly preachy, I think, is not is something that we need to watch out. Fromm didn't quite get that right, and perhaps we're not getting that right totally today. I think there are some ideas for sociological research that could be followed up. We could look at other big books research. We could look at Noam Chomsky, the great American socialist Michael Harrington, Bell Hooks, and Naomi Klein are obvious cases for sociological analysis. I think part of the issue here is the difference between big books and influential writers and intellectuals who reach the level of celebrity. So Fromm reached the level of celebrities, and we can think about Jordan Peterson, Cornel West, and on a lesser level, Judith Butler as examples of, in Butler's case, maybe an academic celebrity, not at the next level. And I think we need to look more specifically at the dynamics of celebrity intellectuals. I think that we want to think about these things as trade-offs. I think sometimes too much of the literature on public sociology involves scholars who want to maintain sociology's scientific and professional status, attacking public sociology. At the same time, in response to that, sometimes we get too many panels or too many discussions of public sociology as a sort of self-help sociology, teaching people to do public sociology, not thinking about the trade-offs. So next slide. And so my own little personal punchline, Fromm talked to and engaged with liberals and conservatives. He didn't allow himself to fall into intellectual orthodoxies. He was willing to critique left-wing authoritarianism. And I think for me, he also maintained a commitment to radical change. Apologies for that partisan ending. I want to end on a political note. So apologies for those who don't share my radical politics. For all of you, I think we can come together with a shared commitment to intellectually honest, rigorous, and politically diverse public sociology. I think Fromm contributes to that. But for those of you who consider yourself democratic socialists, or radicals of various stripes, I think we'll all look for benefit by looking again at Fromm for insights and inspiration, as young people once did in the 1960s. So thank you so much.